Thanks everybody for coming. We have a nice intimate group, and I brought about 6 copies of my book, and I was going to give them to those who ask the best questions. So especially since this is such a small group, I think we can have some interaction. I do have breaks where I ask for audience questions, but at any time, I think you can ask questions. I can't walk too much because Sean, our illustrious videographer, has said I need to stick right here. But I don't know. I might not follow the rules for the whole time. Okay, I'll do my best. So, and I thank you, Sarah, and the library for hosting me. So I just wanted to start out by talking about what I do every morning. And I live in Fall Creek, so I walk up the hill every morning to work. And I get up really early, so I'm usually walking in the dark. And especially the beginning of the semester when it's still warm, there's a lot of trash out there. It makes me very angry because I think every year I have hope it's going to get better. But actually, I think this year is like the worst year. The students this year, when they came back, they're anyway. So, and I do try to pick up trash on my way to work, which means that I engage in this sport called plocking. You've all heard of plocking before, picking up litter while walking. So I'm a plocker. And with each piece of litter that I see, whether it's a can or, one of these Solo cups or whatever it is, I have to, a lot of McDonald's bags actually, and Seneca cigarette wrappers, or packets. I have to decide, am I going to pick up this piece of litter or I'm going to let it go? And it depends on a lot of factors. There's also the grossness factor, but I will. So, yeah. Okay. So, it's kind of a question of what is my responsibility. And if you remember, probably some of you who are in my cohort remember back in 1971, before a bunch of you were born, about this Keep America Beautiful campaign. And it was actually run by Coca-Cola and Solo Cups, I think, Dixie Cup Company, trying to say that, only we can solve this litter problem. Like it's our responsibility as citizens, not the corporation's responsibilities to keep America beautiful. And then they call it the fake crying Indian campaign because he was really an Italian actor, not an Indian, but the whole idea he was crying because of how we had destroyed his lands. So this is just another cartoon, in this case, from the book, making the same point about whose responsibility is all this plastic pollution or climate pollution or litter or whatever. I should mention that Emily Hopkins, who did all the cartoons in my book, she's local here in Ithaca. She used to do cartoons for the New Yorker. And so that's one of the fun things about the book, that we have about 10 cartoons or a few more in the book. So I'm going to talk today about responsibility and our role in the climate crisis. But before that, I'm going to talk about 3 other things, which is effective climate behaviors, what influences the spread of those behaviors, and what I call network climate action. So these are climate behaviors, different things we can do. Did any of you, EVs, heat pumps, plant-rich diet, solar, educating women, and food waste, any of you have an idea which one of those might be more effective in reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Yes? Plant-based diet? It's a good one. Anybody else? Educating women. Okay. Educated women have more choice in family size, right? Because they can stay in school, they can go on to the workforce, so they have more choice. Anything else? Okay. So I don't know how many of you have gone to this drawdown.org website, but it's put together by Paul Hawkins, to do Hawkins and Smith. I don't know if that company sounds familiar to anybody, but he's also written a bunch of books, and he assembled a large group of scientists, and they tried to determine which would be the more effective climate actions for people to take in terms of reducing greenhouse gases. This is called his table of solutions. Actually, there's 82 or something solutions, so I've just taken the top ones. And if you go draw down and then table of solutions, you'll have to click on scenario 1 or scenario 2. I won't go into what's the difference. But the point is that you'll have to click on that in order to order them from top to bottom. So just click on a few times, because otherwise I think they're in alphabetical order. So you can see reduced food waste, which nobody mentioned, plant-rich diets, and family planning and education are top solutions. So why food waste? So food waste, you can see right here. So methane is a strong greenhouse gas, right? A lot stronger than CO2. And food waste is actually the third largest source of methane. I think that's globally, not just in the US. So the other larger petroleum, natural gas, and then enteric fermentation, which is cows, which we'll talk about in a minute. So basically, I think, I can't remember the percentage, but it's like a third or a half. There's a large percentage of what goes to landfills is food waste, and the conditions are anaerobic there. So it's going to produce methane. So that's why food waste is such a problem. The other plant-rich diet, sometimes I feel like a cow. Like today before this, I had a little indigestion. I was burping a lot. Anyways, the reason that plant-rich diet is so important is that cows in particular, not pork and not chicken so much. I'll show you in a minute. But cows have this 4 stomachs. Fortunately, I only have one. And they burp out a lot of methane. And that's actually, I think in the US, well, it's either the second or first source of I think it's about 30% of global methane emissions are from cows. Well, yeah, you can see it right there. Buffalo, small ruminants like goat and sheep have that same digestive system. So they're also emitting methane. But cattle are so much more predominant, especially in this country, but globally, that they're the bigger problem in terms of total emissions. Okay, so you can see that if we were to think about emissions from different foods we eat, beef is just really an outlier. It's way up there. So if anybody wants to do anything in terms of diet about the climate, I'd just say reduce your beef consumption. I like to think of, beef should be a treat or whatever. And if you want to eat meat, you can see poultry and pork are much better, even than dairy, just because they don't have that same digestive system. And I don't know what you can see here, but I really like this slide because it divides the emissions into where they're coming from. So the brown there, so let's just go for beef at the top, is from the farm. So that would be the manure and these, what we call enteric, the stomach emissions. And you can see that land use change is relatively small. So that's clearing land to produce cattle is relatively small for cattle compared to, unfortunately, this is how the laser. Anyway, go down there to dark chocolate, about 5 down. This was like very disturbing for me. And I just found out about it recently because most of these charts that you see in the publications don't have dark chocolate. But you can see the issue there is land use change, right? So it's mostly green. And that's because we're clearing all these forests like palm oil, you've probably heard about, also to plant cacao trees. So there you can, if you have different breeds of different brands of chocolate that you're eating, sometimes they'll have information on this and what kind of farming practices. I don't know how credible it is, but you should be able to maybe choose some brands that are more sustainable than others. Okay, and this is from my book, but if you're thinking about different diets, so, it'd be great if everybody went vegan, but it's totally unrealistic. But you can see if everybody went vegan, that a lot more greenhouse gases or a lot fewer would be emitted. But even if you went, let me read these over here. I'll just read. Okay, so even if you just sort of went the healthy diet or the Mediterranean diet, you're still going to be reducing your emissions relative to the American diet with a lot of meat, especially beef. So do you remember Eric Adams? Like, he's the mayor of New York, and he marketed himself as being vegan. And one day they found him eating a fish sandwich in a restaurant. And so he had to kind of retract, mostly vegan. But I think that's what a lot of people, my colleague here, Alex, I think is 100% vegan for many years, right? But most of us are, I think it's more realistic. We're more, if like I sort of am vegan, but I'm more like Eric Adams, right? I actually don't like fish that much, but if there was some cheese or some, if there was a croissant, like has butter in it, I'm going to be there. I might eat poultry, fish, maybe pork is a little worse. So like for me, I'm thinking, I used to eat venison. After you don't eat meat for a while, you don't really feel like eating meat. But I don't see anything wrong with eating venison. Actually, venison are like cows. They have enteric emissions, but there's too many of the deer around, at least according to the way I feel. And so, raising deer might not be great, but eating deer that somebody's hunted, I think that would fit into climate carnivore. Does that make sense? So you're still eating meat, but you're trying to eat the meats that are lower in emissions. Okay. So this is the question time. This is the end of section 1. Actually, home food waste is the biggest contributor, at least in the US. But it's a good question because you got to think about, there's food loss at the farm level and in the transportation, and then it gets to the grocery store, and then we call it food waste, and then it gets to home, and it's food waste. A lot of people think of composting, but really the best thing we can do is donate food, right? So, volunteer with Friendship Donation Network in Ithaca, which takes food donations and distributes them to poor people. Because, you can think of a hierarchy, right? The best is to reuse the food. And then down lower is, animal feed or compost. Composting's great because it keeps it out of the landfill. But there's higher uses of that waste if we can figure out how to distribute it. So especially from restaurants, it's a little harder from homes, but yeah. And then countries where the road systems aren't good. So you're transporting like tomatoes to the capital. And yeah, there's going to be a lot of spoilage along the way. So good point. All right. So I'm going to number 2, which is what influences the spread of behaviors. And I'm going to talk about 3 things. So the first is choice architecture. And how many of you are familiar with choice architecture? Okay, good. Some people aren't, right? So how many of you are familiar with Homer Simpson? All right, when I show this in my class with Cornell undergraduates, nobody has ever heard of him, and it's like so embarrassing. So I'm not using this anymore with student audiences. But anyway, this is a great example of choice architecture. So, usually Homer just comes in and grabs a donut, right? Or whatever there's on the counter. In this situation, Apu has placed the healthy foods in the convenient location. And so Homer and the policeman would have to reach way up there on top to find the donuts. And instead, maybe they'll just grab healthy, fresh fruits. The whole idea of choice architecture is making the convenient or the easy option the best, I'll call it the correct option. All right, so this is getting back to my little plocking habit again. So one of the things that determines whether I pick up waste is how close I am to the Tang Center, because I pass that on my way to work, and it has a little trash can outside, the Welcome Center by Beebe Lake there. And so this is that trash can there. And, if I'm way down the hill, I might not pick it up because I don't want to carry it that far. But if I'm near there, I might pick it up, right? So that's kind of an example of choice architecture. But one morning, this is a photo I took. It wasn't very good choice architecture because there was a skunk out there. I couldn't believe it. Anyways. So I also did a little experiment. So before they did all that construction by Risley back there, they used to have this little stone bench. I don't know if anybody remembers it. And it's out there in the back by the, it's on the Fall Creek side, and it's by where those dumpsters are. Yeah. And so there used to be somebody who left cigarette butts out there every day. It was really annoying because, cigarette, I'd rather pick up like a beer can than a cigarette butt. So I decided that I would take a little can. This is one of those, this looks like a trash can, but it's actually on that bench that was out there, the stone bench. And it's like one of those tea cans, you get from China like maybe this big. and I left it there in the morning. And then I came back in the afternoon. I thought, oh my gosh, my experiment worked. It was awesome. Anyway, and then another experience I had with choice architecture was actually in China. So we were doing this workshop at Hangzhou Botanic Gardens, really beautiful place. And they all ordered out food for lunch, and it was all takeout. And, we had piles of plastic waste afterwards like this. And so I kind of complained to my host. It's probably kind of rude, but anyways, I said, this is kind of weird. We're doing an environmental workshop and we have all this plastic waste. So the next day, my hostess, she brought into me like a reusable plate and silverware or chopsticks. And then when we actually ate at the cafeteria where the workers at the Botanic Gardens eat. And so they had the sinks there. Everybody had to bring their own plate, right? You had no choice. So it's kind of very strong choice architecture, I'd say. And so we all had to wash our dishes. There was actually, and in the back, you can't see it, but there was actually some kind of UV like sterilizers of your dishes too. But anyways, I thought it was pretty cool. And then another group I'm involved with is called Climate Action Now, which is an app. I suggest you all download it. I'm very, very involved with this app. I'm what they call a content creator. So what this app does, which makes me feel very proud, maybe students can understand that word. It's probably out of date though. I don't know. Anyway, so this app, what it does is that volunteers like me, we create letters. And so you download the app and it's like, scrolling through some cards. And then you decide you like one of the actions that they're asking you to take. So you click on this, or you'd say, do it now. And then a letter will come up. It's a pre-written letter, like I might have written it or another volunteer. It's quite short, but it basically says, dear Congressman, support blah, 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 and support a specific piece of legislation. And because you put in your zip code, it automatically goes to your either federal representative or state representative, depending if it's state or federal legislation. That does a lot more than this, but that's kind of the basics. So basically, it's making it really, really easy to send a lot of letters. I know people don't like written letters. So I think here we're talking about quantity, not quality of letter. But on the other hand, the way I understand, if I send a letter to, Schumer or somebody, or Anna Kellis, some staff member reads it. They probably have some spreadsheet. They check off what was the issue and what was the position of the person who wrote the letter, and then they go on. So you put that all in the first sentence of the letter and move on. So you can do like 20 letters in, a couple minutes on this thing. Yeah?
I noticed the 100 points at the top. Is it sort of gamified?
It's gamified. Yes. That is a very good question. So, the guy that developed it, Brett Walter, he was he's retired. He was a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. And so he went to all the people at Stanford and said, what's the best way to make this? And so there's some social media features and stuff. I find them rather annoying. I just want to get a bunch of letters sent, but I guess a lot of people like them. I still think it's really hard to really gamify it because my son has done it and it's like 33 or something. And he says it's a little boring. So I guess it's not as good as obviously it's not as good. Yeah. I think so, depending on the demography. Okay. So this is just a little summary. Choice architecture is when the default or the convenient option is the right option. And, there's different things you can do to... Are you wanting a book too? Do you feel left out?
I sort of have a question.
Okay.
So I just did a cleanup this weekend.
Uh-huh.
And one of the most common things we found were the corners of chip bags.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm older than I look. We used to be able to just pull open the chip bag and the bag would be intact. And now the design of the bag is pull here, and usually the corner comes off. And so it's kind of like who controls. I can influence by writing Frito-Lay, but for whatever reason, you know, the modus operandi of opening a bag of chips is now this whole thing
Right.
that's causing this problem that maybe they didn't even design in the first place.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a question. I don't know if it's a good question.
It's a point.
The point about, you know, even the data that you just talked about with respect to some aide, probably a junior aide in the congressman's office, tick, tick, tick in a spreadsheet, what impact does that data really have? Ultimately, just like 50 more people wrote me a postcard on this topic.
Okay. So I don't have the research, but those of us involved with climate action now get this question all the time. And one of the things we do is action parties. So what that means is, like, we did one on the birds and the bees legislation, which is a New York State piece of legislation to reduce the use of neonicotinoids. So you could, you know, people talk a lot about how the insect populations are really declining, and they think it might be due to this one group of pesticides called neonicotinoids. So we did an action party, which means we have a couple speakers on this topic, and people come on for an hour at night on Zoom. And then we have like 50 actions lined up. So in the case of neonicotinoids, it's only one bill. So we'd have like 50 recipients. And in that case, it wouldn't just go to my own. I could send it to any person I wanted to. That's, you know, do you want to send it to this representative? Do you want to send it to this representative? And we sent about 2,000 letters in an hour. And a few days later, the bill passed. And we can't say it was from us, but I think they do pay attention, I think, to these letters. They might not read them and, you know, appreciate your personal story, but I think they pay attention. We also did one for the methane rule change in New York. And again, the legislation was passed, or no, in that case, Hochul was trying to rescind some legislation or change some legislation about how methane is accounted for. And she changed her position on it shortly thereafter. So I mean, what are you going to do, right? You know, I think this is one of the more effective things you can do, especially if you can get a big group, like through one, you know, we have a couple times a month, these parties on particular issues or types of legislation. And then I've done a lot of these on the Farm Bill, because that's a big piece of legislation. And some of them I can go check, like they've had over 700 people send a letter. So I feel like you have to, you know, we can't succumb to environmental despair. But, you know, I'm sure there's other more effective things I could do, but probably not unless I retire. I can spend more time. Well, I think in terms of solutions, there are solutions that are government sort of policy related. So for example, date labels. So best used by, you know, throw this out, whatever they say. They're not regulated in this country except for baby food. So there's been a lot of push to get, I guess, the FDA to regulate them in terms of, so that they're all standardized. Do you need me to move?
Yeah.
Okay. So to get them all standardized so that you won't throw it out as soon as it says best used by, right? Best used by isn't even when the company thinks it's bad. That's just when they think it's not going to have its peak taste. So that's a potential solution. There's actually about 30 different suggested food waste, what we call actions or letters on Climate Action Now, because I worked on that issue. So some of the others are like trying to help farmers to allow gleaning without having so much personal liability if somebody comes onto their property and takes food that would be lost, in other words. We should have food, like we have recycling units of that. Personally, I think it would be a lot more important if we had food waste collection, which like Denver has now. Toronto had when my daughter went to school there as an undergraduate. So, 10, 15 years ago. So there are a lot of, I don't know if that's solutions anyway, besides just, you look at what's in your refrigerator before you go shopping. So questions, we already had a few on choice architecture. Any more? Okay, I'm going to go on to norms. try to go through this a little faster. So norms, there's different kinds of norms, and here are some examples of descriptive norms. So that's what everybody else does, or what you think everybody else does. So I could give you a message like 75% of Americans express concern about the climate. Most elders volunteer. 9 out of 10 Democrats contribute money to an environmental organization. So how many of you are familiar with this towel experiment in a hotel? No? Okay, so there's a few of you that aren't. I'll go through it real quick because maybe about 3 or 4 of you are already. So these scientists did a norm experiment in hotels. So this is for hotel guests. So you walk into the room and you see a message that says, join your fellow guests. And I won't read the whole thing, but you can see it's about social pressure. 75% of guests are reusing their towels. The other message was help save the environment. So do the right thing for the environment. So A or B, which one encouraged the reuse of towels?
A.
A. Wow, you guys are really good. Okay. So the descriptive norm, more than trying to, I don't know if you call shame you, but, like try to incite your environmental values. All right. But you can't use a descriptive norm for vegans because most of us aren't vegans. And most of the people don't write letters supporting climate policies, right? So what kind of message could you use? So here's where dynamic or trending norms come in. They're the same thing, just different researchers have used different terms. And there the idea is I'm going to give you a message that says this behavior is increasing. So there's been a 600% increase in the number of consumers who are vegans over the past, over 3 years. So the idea is there's a trend. I want to, get with it and be part of the trend. And so again, they did this experiment. So I think this was at Stanford in the dining halls. And so there were 2 messages. One was what we call the static or the descriptive norm. So that said 30% of Americans make an effort to limit their meat. And the other one was a dynamic norm. People are starting to limit their meat consumption. Over the last 5 years, 30% of Americans have started to make an effort to limit meat. And 3 in 10 people have changed their behavior regarding meat consumption. So A or B? Which one? B. B. Okay. All right. So these are the results. I think you already got it. So then this is the control. So there was a message, but it had nothing to do with meat consumption. So this is what? The static norm. This y-axis is the number of students who ordered a meatless meal. So this is, you guys got it?
Static.
The static, yeah. And this is the dynamic. So I think that the idea of dynamic norms is pretty interesting, and because everybody wants to do what's the trending thing right now, right? Okay. So this is the end of this little section on norms. Descriptive and dynamic norms can influence behavior. You can use dynamic norms when behavior is not prevalent. And you can use norm message with family and friends. Any more questions on this section? Okay, we'll move on. So I had that thing about using norm message. Oh, this one, if you can't read this, how much are you planning to tip? So this man is asking this little girl. So the idea, what is the tipping norm here? Okay, I'm going to talk about social networks. So this is really about influencing family and friends. So you can see 3 different networks here. So the idea is that this circle is an individual, and these lines, they're ties between individuals. So if they're short ties, like over there, that means I'm talking to that individual or doing things with that individual very often. If they're those are called strong ties. If they're like this, they're called weak ties. So maybe that person lives the other side of town, and I don't see them very often. I'm not doing something with them very often. So in what's called the regular or the close tie network, imagine that red arrow is a person, and they have a close tie with the person next to them and the person who's one other person away. But the interesting thing is that one other person away is also a friend with the person close to them. But the point is, this is a little convoluted, but my friends are also friends with each other. Small world network, you've replaced some of those really close ties with some more distant ties. And then in this random network, there's a lot of weak ties and not very many close ties. So this might be like close friends and families, but this might be, maybe people that you follow on X or whatever.
Maybe may I ask, when you say close, is that a physical space?
I think that's a really good question.
Thank you.
I got one in the library.
Yeah, that's what we do.
So because it's diagrammed as physical, but it's really how many times. It's a survey to map these networks. It's like, how many times do you communicate with that person? So it's a little confusing that way. All right. So
embedded people in social network.
okay.
You can see here the left-hand side has that kind of residential.
Okay, I'll just narrate this. So this is a close tie.
Simultaneously, and what you see.
These are people who have adopted the behavior, and this is that weak tie. And the idea is which one will spread the behavior, in which one will the behavior spread the fastest.
In the casual contact network, you can see it sort of spreads all over the network.
So this is casual.
And in fact, at the end of this process, you get many more adopters in the residential network than in the casual contact network. Now this is striking and really surprising. So what it means is that behavior spread really differently than disease does. So the intuitions from epidemiology about diffusion dynamics don't generalize. But of course, for practical applications, what this means is when you design a health policy intervention, for example, you want to get people in Southern Africa to use condoms, you can't target the same rapid diffusion networks that allow disease like AIDS to spread very quickly. In fact, you target different kinds of networks entirely, sort of closely structured residential networks. And it also means more generally for the design of online communities where you want to promote desirable health behaviors. Okay, so I'm not sure if you could hear all that, but the point is the way behavior spread is different than the way disease spreads. So you might remember there was a measles outbreak at Disneyland, Disney World, whatever the one is in California, a while back. So I could walk by Evelyn, right? And I might walk by you a little closer than this, and I could get measles. I might never know you, right? But in the, Disneyland, I walk by you as close, very weak tie network because I don't communicate with you. I don't do anything with you except for show up at Disneyland at the same time. And I got measles. There was another outbreak at a Minneapolis airport. I don't know if you remember, same kind of thing. But if I was trying to convince you to not eat so much beef, I'd need to know you pretty well. Like we'd probably want to have dinner several times together and, be communicating, have the same friends. Does that make sense? So that's the point of this simulation. It's work by Damon Santola at the University of Pennsylvania. I think he got his PhD at Cornell. He has a great website if you want to search him. Does a lot of this kind of network stuff and with behaviors. So a close tie network where these behaviors are going to spread the quickest. And this is just another way to think about it. So if you start at the left, the person in the black, they've adopted the plant-rich diet. And the person in the middle isn't, but they're trying to change that person in the middle. The next one over, 2 people have adopted the plant-rich diet, but still the person in the middle hasn't. Then 3 of that person's friends have adopted plant-rich diet. And at that point, maybe they'll change over. So the point is you need, as I'm going to have here, multiple messages from multiple messengers in order to change difficult to change behaviors. Complex behaviors spread more rapidly in close tie networks. So that's where you can have a good influence, big influence on family and friends, and you can influence your close networks. This down here, this is, again, from the book, guys. I've signed up for a climate hunger strike. So roommate trying to convince roommates, close tie network, to go out and do a hunger strike. That's probably a pretty difficult behavior. So anybody have any questions? Okay, we're going to move on because we have about 15 minutes left.
All right, so I'm going to talk about network climate action, which is a big focus of the book. And what that's about is just, we've learned about effective actions, taking those actions yourself and applying some of this research we've learned about and other research to influence others to take that action alongside you. So we've talked about effective climate actions. So I did one in my department, Natural Resources and the Environment. This was before COVID. And I chose to voluntarily pay for carbon offsets. Actually, they're not really carbon offsets officially, but basically contribute money when you fly, take airplane flights. And my network was my faculty colleagues. And then I later added my family and friends as I learned about some of this information about how to influence people in networks. So I chose, the action was donated money to the Finger Lakes Climate Fund, which is part of Sustainable. No, they've changed it's like Sustainable Finger Lakes now. It used to be, I think, Tompkins. And they have a calculator there. You can put in where you're traveling and they'll give you some value for the offset. But again, officially, it's not really an offset. It's not, I won't go into the details, but we'll call it a contribution. And the cool thing about this organization is that the money they collect goes to low-income people in our region and helps them to weatherize their homes. So I put Norm's philanthropy there because I think a lot of people, we might not think about giving to a climate organization, but so many people give to like social causes, right? And one of the things I found in my department was that people were pretty reluctant to contribute any contributions offsetting their travel. But when I told them that it was a social cause, some of them became more interested. So, as I said, this was a very difficult action to convince my colleagues to do. Actually, I think it made people pretty defensive, like I should be able to travel, where you get into being like virtue signaling there. But I did my best. And one of the things I did was on this Finger Lakes Climate Fund website, you can form teams and then you have these carbon races. So, you want your team to be up number 1. We were number 5 a while back. And so what I did, because I was still trying to convince my colleagues to do this, is I convinced my family to do it. And so then I could say, hey, more and more people are joining our team. The dynamic norm, don't you want to join our team? And I think I had around 30 people on the team at the end, but I will say some of them I gave a few extra incentives, like paid for my kids' travel offset and then they put their name up there, that kind of thing. But I was using dynamic norms. So anyways, and then I've had my students do network climate action in my class. And I just wanted to point out that you can do it not just for things like we call lifestyle behaviors, like plant-rich diet and food waste. This food waste one was I call it cute, but maybe the student wouldn't want me to call it cute. But anyway, this was a student from Shenzhen in China. And his network was his family. So they have to choose an action and a network, and his action was reducing food waste. So he talks to his family and found out he probably knew this already, but they were wasting about half of their food every night. And then he started talking to them about it, and he's doing this project for the class, and how come they're wasting so much food? Well, he found out that his dad would stop by and stop by at a restaurant, have dinner with colleagues on the way home from work, but his mom was preparing food for the dad, the whole family, every night. And so his dad started texting his mom when he's going to not come home for dinner. She doesn't prepare dinner for him. And then they got their food waste way down to practically 0. So that was kind of a fun little project. But I've had students who, tried to do more policy actions, like convince people to support, it was their family, to support the Seattle Transportation Plan. And I've had a bunch of students do a women's health and education action, and they've raised money for this organization called FOM International. I think they're going to be doing a tabling this semester, actually, in the Mann lobby there. And that organization supplies free menstrual supplies to girls in developing countries, which enables them to stay in school because they're not embarrassed, and then they can also stay in the workforce. Okay, so just climate behaviors spread among family and friends, network climate action, and that you can do these actions, whether it's volunteering, ask somebody to volunteer alongside you or contribute alongside you, or write letters alongside you, or do the plant-rich diet and the more lifestyle things. Okay. Questions? Yes?
How do you explain how you monetarily compensate for your carbon emissions? When you're trying to tell somebody to donate in as a way to compensate for emitting carbon, how do you explain the relationship between those two things?
Well, I think what you're getting at is what I was referring to, that these weren't really offsets. So there's different ways to figure out, if I fly to Denver to visit my daughter, like what would be, how much CO2 am I emitting? And then there's different ways to figure out what the cost of that is. So I think when Obama was president, there was like the social cost of carbon. So there's a cost, like this website, I don't know where they're getting their data from, but it's very low. Like that flight might cost me $10, and then there's social cost of carbon, which I can't remember, but it might be $60 because they're figuring in the fact that there's not just, I don't know, like a flood, but it actually is impacting people's lives, right? So it's not just infrastructure is destroyed, but it's impacting people's lives. Or a lot of these offset programs are also planting trees. So they might be determining what's the cost of planting so many trees that's going to supposedly absorb the carbon. But these are very controversial. And so a lot of people don't really believe in offsets because the math on them are kind of funny. That's why, to me, I like Finger Lakes Climate Fund because I just know it's going to go to people that weatherize their homes. There's no math involved in my head. It's just doing a good thing. And then recently, and if you're interested, you could email me. I came across this book on social equity cost of carbon, which then figures into the fact that, let's just say there's a flood in Ithaca. I have insurance, but maybe somebody else that doesn't have the same income that I do. And so the cost to them is a lot greater than it is to me. And obviously, when you're talking about developing countries, the cost to a flood is probably a lot greater than it would be to me. I have a solid home. They might have a home that's just going to be wiped away. So, and that I figured it was quite expensive. Like I looked at the flight to Denver, which was going to cost me $400 or $500, and the social equity cost of carbon was like the same price as the ticket. So I'm not sure where that money would go, but it's just something to think about. Does that answer your question? Would you like a book too?
Marianne, I'm just going to follow up on that. I thought that was a great question because it is a complex. I think it is complex, and you have to what is that? But I thought your example was brilliant. The house that has now been weatherized, and it seems like it would be fairly simple on their website, and maybe they do this to say, with this number of donations, we weatherize this house, which now is essentially saving, is how much carbon emissions is that? That could almost, that's sort of an easy, sometimes it's sort of the communication.
Yeah, they call it offsets. They are very transparent about where the money's going, but I don't think they've done that math.
Right. And it would be a powerful, you could just send somebody right to that saying, look, this house, this $10 or whatever is part of this project that has resulted in that carbon. So that's how that's the carbon savings that your payment is doing. It's a nice idea. It's a nice way.
Jenny and Carol, we only got like 7 minutes, so be real quick.
Another question from the online audience is, should we be worried about social network effects that encourage anti-environmental behaviors?
Yes.
Yes.
It can go both ways. And Carol?
I was just going to mention that some institutions actually pay that. Like, for instance, I work for Center for International Forestry Research, and when some of us fly, then the institution pays the offset. And I think they do it by the kind that is replanting trees.
Yeah. Several universities do that. I think the UC California system does it, University of Maryland. I was on a committee that tried to get Cornell to do it, but we haven't made much progress. Okay, I'm going to go to the last section. And that is getting back to that question that I presented at the beginning. What is my responsibility, my role in the climate crisis? And I came across this author, Robin Zhang. She's at Glasgow now, I think. She was at, I think NYU, Shanghai. And she wrote this book about, well, it's about role ideals, and it's about sort of what is your role in the climate crisis. And there's sort of 4 premises. We all have multiple roles: friend, parent, partner, churchgoer, volunteer, student, teacher. You can imagine other roles that you might have. And we have role ideals for each of those. So if you're a parent, or maybe a child of parents, you will have ideals for the way you want to be as a parent, or the way you want to treat your parents, for example, right? And the same in our professional lives and volunteer lives. And that we can incorporate climate thinking into our roles. So if you're a parent, just as an example, maybe you can serve more plant-rich meals at home, or maybe you can, make sure that there's less food waste or whatever. And so you're incorporating climate into your role as a parent and a provider. Okay. And then the last thing she talks about is we can push the boundaries of what we see currently to achieve these ideals. So this is just a schematic from the book, the idea that here's our role, and then we have role ideals, and can we sort of push out and really try to do more just in our everyday roles, everyday life. So just as an example, anyone can push their role boundaries to achieve their role ideal. I've already talked about plant-rich meals. Volunteering with a climate organization or your church is really interesting. I think faith-based institutions are increasingly wanting to do something about climate. Or, and this has been kind of controversial, engage your students in climate action, given the crisis. What's the boundary between education and activism is something I've been thinking about and acting on. So that is it. You got this one? Can you read it in the back? In her role as a mother and investment banker, Megan was ideal. As a Rockette, less so. So that's from Emily too. So that's all that I have. I have a few more books, so we actually have 4 minutes. So does anybody else have any questions? Just thank the library very much, and thanks to those of you who came today, including those online. Mm-hmm.
I have a question about, I feel like I try to do this, but then I often come across as a negative Nancy. So do you have suggestions on how to promote this positively rather than negatively, and like that whole encouraging people to join the trend rather than being like, oh, all these things are packaged individually and it's the worst thing ever, but and as a parent, always correct.
Yeah, so I think there's 2 questions there. One is what Robin Kimmer, and I think she's speaking on campus like next month. I don't know if you know her. She's author of Braiding Sweetgrass. And she talks about environmental despair and how destructive it is. Like it's just going to make you powerless. So, and the way I like to think of it, if you were a Black person in the 60s or 50s in the South, like you would have thought, well, whatever I do is useless. But, some people like formed social networks, right? And they really did something, and they made a huge difference. So environmental despair is really not very useful. And the second thing I think is more about virtue signaling. So like if I tell you I'm vegan, you'll probably go, what a jerk. So, there are ways I could say it, like Eric Adams, instead of saying I'm vegan, he could have said, well, I'm trying to reduce my meat consumption. Once in a while I have a fish sandwich. Kind of more like what I said, or what Alex said, you put a cookie in front of me on a plane and I haven't eaten for it. We all, you could think of a bazillion examples of this, right? Like I just got a heat pump, but I still have a gas car, for example. So nobody's perfect, but we're all kind of trying to work towards something. And there's a great paper that if you email me, I could send you, called Moral Rebels and How to Communicate Without Making People Defensive.
I love it.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is about climate education. I feel like a lot of people want to learn about climate change, but when it comes to climate change, there are a lot of technical words, like you hear mitigation, red, MAPA, and so, and a lot of people lose interest. So how do you like encourage like climate education to break these technical words for like maybe parents, teachers to understand?
I guess it depends on your goal. Like if you're trying to educate people about the science of climate, you're going to take a different approach. A lot of those acronyms are a lot with policies like NDCs, nationally determined contribution. Like there's just so many acronyms that kind of drive you crazy. On the other hand, if you want people to reduce their meat consumption, you don't even need to talk about climate, right? You might say, oh, this is healthy. I've tried some new recipes. It's really fun. It's really delicious. Why don't you come over and try them? Then maybe if they ask you why, you might talk about climate. Does that make sense? Not really?
I just feel like, oh, we want children to understand climate change, but when it comes to like climate change, we still go back to them with like all these technical words, like telling them adaptation, mitigation, and a lot of them are interested, but like they find it very hard to understand these words. And I know that they are trying to like make education an agenda during COPs and the UNFCCC, but like they are not like breaking these technical words into specific words that children can understand.
Right. Yeah, I would probably just try to engage children in activities and have them learn afterwards, because, who wants to learn a lot of terms, right? And they are confusing. But I'll give you a book. And we're at 5:00, so I'm sure everybody wants to, get going. But if you want to have them, hang out, I can hang out for a while. We can have a little more discussion. But thank you.